Thanks, Tom, for joining us on this conversation of change. I'll first start with an introduction. I'll first introduce our guest today, Thomas Kerr, lead climate specialist, South Asia at the World Bank Group. Uh, Tom Kerr is the lead climate specialist. In this role, he supports dynamic region by developing policies and investments that increase resilience to climate change and accelerate decarbonization. Tom was the lead author of the WBG's Climate Investment Opportunities Report Series, which helps clients to identify promising green investment opportunities tied to government's pledges made as part of the Paris Agreement. He created and managed the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, a public-private partnership platform launched by the World Bank Group at COP21 in Paris to work with the government, business, and civil society groups to accelerate the uptake of effective carbon pricing policy around the world. Prior to working with the World Bank Group, Tom was director of climate change at the World Economic Forum, where he facilitated high-level dialogues between leaders in the government, business, and civil society at the annual meetings in Davos, the G20, and other intergovernmental platforms as well. Before that, Tom worked for International Energy Agency, where he led the development of a suite of clean energy technology roadmaps and provided clean energy progress reports to Clean Energy Ministerial, both at the G8 and G20 and the UNFCCC. Tom has LLM in International Environment Law from Georgetown University Law Center, a Juris Doctorate from DePaul College of Law, and a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Michigan. Thanks, Tom. Such a pleasure to be talking to you on this Conversation of Change episode. So my first question is this, like, what does a typical day as a lead at World Bank Group for climate change, focusing on South Asia look like?
Yeah, thank you, Kaushik, and it's my pleasure to be part of this conversation. It's when you're listing my experience, it has been a journey of various different organizations. I would say, I think the World Bank, where I'm at now, is my favorite job in my career. I've had a lot of different roles, but what I really like about the World Bank Group is that I played roles in doing analysis. I played roles in sort of being an advocate for climate action. I've played roles kind of in the implementation role. And I think the nice thing about the World Bank is, on the one hand, we are a big lender, right? We have money and we're looking to spend it in the right places. But at the same time, we also recognize that, the way the markets are now, money, we need sometimes to create the opportunities to invest in the cleaner or the more resilient solutions that are going to help us with climate change. And so the World Bank can kind of use the money, but then also it's a bit of a carrot to say, okay, we might need a few changes in policies, or we might need you to do something to make the market much bigger. And then, once we make an investment, we can kind of show people this is possible. And then a lot of other private sector and other investors can come in and follow our lead. And so it's a really fun role to play where you're kind of, an advocate, but you're also an implementer. So it keeps you honest too. So, it's hard sometimes. You hit roadblocks, or you hit problems along the way, but then we learn, and then we can share those with the international community, and again hoping to get other people to come in and follow our lead. The other thing we do that I think is really interesting is we kind of straddle the public and the private sector, which I think is super important in the climate space. We have to create the policy. The old days of sort of saying we're going to wait for technologies to lower their costs and then they'll get to market is just not a luxury we have with the urgency of climate change. And so we need governments to be putting in place the right policies, but then we also need to be talking to companies and investors about where they're looking to invest. So specifically to your question, it's a very dynamic role. I'm based in Washington, D.C., but I travel to the region quite often. We have a team here, but also a much larger team in the region, mainly in India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, and some of the other countries. And I guess there's sort of four things I do. One is sort of we're trying, as I said before, we're trying to lend money and provide policy advice to governments. And so it's looking at, for example, in India, the Prime Minister made a net zero target last fall at the COP, and we're trying to help the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change to figure out exactly how much does that cost to reach that net zero target. What sectors have to do what, and sort of how does that sort of evolve over time. And they're also looking at doing a carbon market, and based on some of the work that's done there. So we're helping the government kind of think through the architecture of that carbon market, tapping into, we have a big pool of experts here in Washington that are helping countries across the world with carbon markets. So that's sort of the first thing. I think the second thing is analytics at the country level. We're trying to assess in a much better way, what are the impacts of climate change on a country right now? Whether it's coastal flooding, whether it's urban heat island effect and during the heat waves, whether it's, you've seen the flooding in Pakistan, these are all having dramatic impacts on countries' development pathways. And so we need to get much more granular about what are those impacts, and then what are the ways to build up resilience. And so we're doing a lot of analysis around that. And then finally, how do you finance some of that? Because it's quite expensive and it has to be done urgently. I think the third thing we do is around we have corporate commitments. We have a target to have 35% of the World Bank money be climate friendly. And so we have to make sure that every project has some climate elements to it. And we're also working on becoming Paris aligned as an institution. So there's a lot of work going into just making sure that teams that are not, their day-to-day work is not climate, they have to be thinking about this. And we provide a lot of corporate support and guidance. And then the final thing I do is it's very fun. It's kind of things like this as well. It's kind of telling the story of South Asia to the rest of the world and making sure people realize the vulnerability, the extreme, challenges that the countries are facing now, but also the fantastic innovations and solutions that are coming up from the bottom level and the grassroots, and making sure that gets fed into the global dialogue. So one example there is Bangladesh. Over the years, we've been helping them to really become much more coastal resilient to cyclones as they come. And so they're much less likely to have, I think we were in the thousands of deaths before, and now we're in the hundreds because they've been able to build up shelters and have warning systems. And actually the Netherlands, which is a very low-lying country and you think is a very developed country, is now asking Bangladesh, hey, what have you done? How can I learn from you? So I think that's part of our job too, is to make sure that what happens in South Asia is going out to the rest of the world.
Thanks, Tom. I think thanks for sharing all of those 4 important points around what you work on. When we looked at your experience and where you started your career with U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in Washington, and your education has been in economics and environmental law. If you can share, how did that prepare you for such behavioral interventions that you have done in that job at the start of your career?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And so at the time, I don't want to pat myself on the back too much. There weren't too many climate lawyers back in the mid 90s when I graduated law school. And I think I really wanted to, I didn't want to work for a law firm and sort of defend the polluters. I wanted to go and find solutions. And the EPA at the time did not have regulatory authority to regulate greenhouse gases. And so, but they were doing something around what they called voluntary programs. And so what it was, being a lawyer, I was happy to help them structure these programs so they really had a lot of, teeth to them, and they were very effective. And so, for example, the one thing I did at the beginning was methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. It's emitted from landfills and coal mines and natural gas systems, but it's actually a fuel, and it's very valuable. And so we came up with voluntary programs that kind of went to these sources like a landfill, and we said, you're sitting on an opportunity here. Would you like to work with us to try to cash into, how do you develop the technology? How do you capture the gas and then produce power and then sell it back to the utility? But each step in that, so, collecting the gas and then figuring out how much gas you have and how you finance it, and then how you might sell it to the utility, required kind of negotiating with the utility. It required some contracts. So we had to come up with standardized contracts. We came up with a memorandum of understanding where, they would sign up with us and they would agree that they were going to take certain actions. And so that had some legal aspects to it. And then also with the IPCC at the time, there wasn't consensus on how you actually measure emissions from these sorts of sources. And so I had to help with some of that. I think in general, it's now we've seen actually that these methane programs that started as a voluntary initiative in the 90s, now you may have seen that the Biden administration just recently passed a big climate bill. There is methane regulation in that bill. And I'd like to say that the work we did in the 90s to kind of lay the foundation to collect the data, to think through how, what the sources were, is now informing that regulation as we go forward. Another program that was very popular at the time that you may even still see on some appliances was called Energy Star. And this was where, we realized that, laptops and computers, actually the famous story is my boss at the time was walking through the office after everybody went home, and he saw all these computers on and the lights on, and he thought, what a huge waste of energy. Why, no one realizes they leave for the day and they just don't turn things off. And so, why can't we work with computer manufacturers to have them go to sleep when nobody has touched them in 5 minutes, or a copier, or, other sorts of products. And so we got into we had to negotiate with the equipment suppliers and the manufacturers of these products to come up with standards that showed, like, okay, are you X% more efficient, than the standard? And if you are, you get this label, and then we'll recognize you for environmental leadership. And it kind of exploded from there, from just copiers and computers to, now there's ceiling fans, there's refrigerators, there's whole home buildings are labeled Energy Star. It's really taken off because the concept, people get it, that, it's not clear just by looking at a product whether it's efficient. So if you know that EPA has done the homework and sort of assessed the efficiency, then you as a consumer can purchase it and know you feel confident that it's going to be helping the environment. So I think these kind of labeling programs are a great example of, you don't always need a heavy regulatory mandate. You can use, information and sort of consumer outreach, and you can achieve a lot of really good goals. And I think over time too, we did a lot of work on tracking, what were the impacts of these voluntary measures, and they had significant greenhouse gas reductions that wouldn't have happened because we didn't have any regulatory authority at the time.
Thank you for sharing about that. I think I've always been curious about how all of these small things that have started coming into implementation, right? Like it's been around for a long time around energy conservation, and
Right.
there's an equivalent of that in India as well. That is kind of like done by the government through a bureau. Thanks for sharing about that. Currently, I think you have also been associated with the largest institutions like World Economic Forum, IEA, and IFC. So in this capacity, like when you are leading the work on climate change in South Asia, so what do you see as the biggest challenge in your role, and how do you navigate those challenges as a career professional?
So I would say right now in the South Asia context in particular, I've been mostly focusing on what you might call mitigation in my career. So how do you reduce emissions and do it in an effective way? And there's many opportunities there. And I think South Asia does obviously have sizable emissions, and they're growing because the countries are growing. And so we have solutions. I think you've seen solar, for example, in India go from, when I was at IEA, you were mentioning this is like 2010. India wasn't really on the map in solar power. And now you look fast forward to today, I think they're the world's 5th largest solar market. And I think that's because of a concerted set of policies and carrots and sticks that the government's put in place, and also sort of, mandates for utilities at the state level, as well as national policies, and then private sector investment. So it's been a really interesting journey to see. But it's really getting to the point when India, solar power is kind of mainstream, where it's lower cost than coal on the margin. And there's rooftop and smaller scale applications that still need a little bit of help, but it's not such a big push. What I do see as my biggest challenge now is, I was in Nepal, and there was a lot of rain and flooding, and then landslides over some of the roads that then became impassable. And 90% of the traffic in Nepal goes by road. There's no rail or ships or anything. So the country was stopped, because this is a major artery. Or, the flooding in Pakistan that I mentioned earlier. These sorts of climate impacts are accelerating and getting much more intense in the countries, and it's having an economic impact. And what it needs is more resilient roads. You need more resilient coastal zones. You need more resilient crops, climate smart agriculture. And these are much harder to do because they don't have a return on investment, let's say, like a solar power project does. And so you have to take a different approach and think through, how do you finance resilience? And it's not always, a hard infrastructure and a huge investment. It can sometimes be, like I was mentioning in Bangladesh, a community-based approach where you work with community groups, and you build like early warning systems and small shelters that can then be used to schools or other sorts of community benefits. but somebody has to pay for it in the end, and we need to be working with the governments and with the donors as well as the private sector to come up with new ways to finance resilience. I think that's my number one priority, and I don't have the silver bullet right now of exactly how you do that, but that's going to be a top priority for us, and it has been a priority, but it's going to really be accelerating going forward. So if anybody out there has ideas, I think this is a really important area to be getting into. To solve South Asia's, help them become more resilient to climate change.
Right. And clearly, I mean, South Asia is a region with abundance of innovation and ideas as well. And
Yeah.
in the climate action space, how do you see the role of talent and your take on, like, how whether South Asia is prepared with the right kind of talent that is required for the kind of action that is required, and what can someone like us, Climate Asia, do in that space?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think, what I mentioned coming into this field, it was, we were the climate people and we were trying to influence, I spent a lot of my career has been like trying to convince, okay, you work in infrastructure or energy or transport or, buildings, agriculture. They don't think of themselves as I'm a climate person. It's been trying to be an influencer and a change agent to say, actually, you should, because number one, it's going to cause a risk to your future business model. And if you don't think about resilience measures, it's going to ruin, you're not going to be able to prosper. But also there's profitable opportunities. You mentioned I did this investment opportunities report. I think there are, as the costs come down for technologies and as you see the innovation, there's a lot of opportunities. So I think it's not as easy as it was before to kind of come in and be a climate generalist. So I would encourage you and others to kind of think about, which sectors are you interested in? Where are the solutions you're most, is it at the community level with, let's say, green buildings and green design of, architecture? And, we need more people thinking about city design or urban city design that's more pedestrian friendly and more, you're not always thinking about automatically building a lot of cars that have a lot of emissions, or, getting into, solar energy may be tackled, but what about, offshore wind power, engineers that can think about how to do that, or green hydrogen is really exciting. It's really come down in costs. From when I was at IEA, it was really not possible. And now people are realistically doing this. How do you, there's a lot of water impacts of creating green hydrogen. How do you minimize that? What are some of those solutions? What are the supply chains? And so, it's sector by sector. It has, healthcare has its own, it has to think about the refrigerants it uses when it transports medicines. And, it has to make sure that those are beneficial for the climate. So it's kind of thinking through at a more granular level, how do you kind of climate smart or climate friendly different sectors? And then, over time, maybe you've done that for, let's say, the agriculture sector. You can then generalize and provide those sorts of skills to other sectors. But I think it's harder to come in now, like I did, as a sort of generalist and then apply my solutions. I think maybe picking the sector is one thing to be thinking about for your approach going forward. I think another one is just the role of technology and artificial intelligence and remote sensing and GAS and things like that. I mean, we can do so much more. I talked about a carbon market before in India, and we had a round. You may have followed, 20 years ago with what they called the Clean Development Mechanism and CDM, which was the voluntary credits. And there was a lot of skepticism. Are these real? Are they really? Are these a greenwashing? Now we can use these technologies to prove that yes, okay, you said this forest will not be chopped down. We've just flown a drone over the top, or we're doing some, satellite imagery, and we see it's still there and it's growing. And I think, those are great opportunities to be getting into, like, what's the role of technology in ensuring that, these green benefits are being delivered, because, investors are they're hungry for sort of credible green credits out there, and they're not easy to find. So those are just some ideas I might have in terms of your future direction.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. And particularly when it comes to when we work with a lot of young professionals, we often get this question that, what are the sort of skills that is required to work in this space? And particularly, I'll go back to the example of your work with Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition.
Mm.
You work with so many different actors in the ecosystem. So for someone to develop into that place, to be able to work with such coalitions, so what do you think young professionals should aim at? What are the skills that they should be thinking about to develop?
Yeah, number one, I think is sort of like empathy and listening skills, because I think, that's a perfect example. It's a very controversial topic. Either you're a climate advocate and you're really angry that there aren't stronger prices on carbon, or you're a company and you're very concerned that, this is going to ruin your business model and make you not competitive. And the government's kind of in the middle saying, this is a political minefield, I don't know what to do. So you need somebody who can sit in the shoes of every person around the table and try to be a broker, a negotiator of okay, what's a path forward? So what struck me with this, with carbon pricing was, everybody was saying we needed a price on carbon. And governments, though, kept saying, well, we can't, we're really worried that companies are going to be, if we put a price on carbon, they're going to go across the border and pollute somewhere else. And we need those industries to grow our economies. And so we're concerned about our own national competitiveness. And so we can't set a high price on carbon. But then we started to look, a lot of companies had set their own internal prices on carbon as sort of a risk mitigation measure, and they were much higher than what governments were envisioning. So we were seeing like an average price on carbon of like $6 a ton of CO2, and this is like in 2015 or so. And companies were putting in place like a $40 a ton, $80 a ton. And so we thought, okay, this is a great opportunity for a conversation. Let's bring them all around the table and have a company tell the government, here's why I'm pricing it at $80 a ton. And we learned very quickly that you get past that sort of initial impression, and then it was really like, okay, what is practical here? And we learned companies said, we're actually willing to accept a slowly rising price on carbon. We just want to have some predictability, and so we know like over 5 years it's going to stay flat, and then after that it'll raise a little bit. And so if we can have an input into the design of it and see like these pathways, we can then plan our investments, and we're not going to be concerned so much about the competitiveness. And then the advocates were saying, we want it to be the highest price possible. But then as they sat around the table and they listened to this, they realized, okay, this is more realistic, and this is how we see change happen. Is it's not always a big bang; it's a slow evolution. And so the good news, I would say, is that, I don't want to say it was completely because of the Carbon Pricing Coalition, but I was just looking at the data now that even this year now, the EU CO2 price in the European Union has now gotten to be about $80 or $100 a ton. You see Korea and California at about $40 a ton. And even like some of the carbon taxes in places like Singapore and South Africa have started to go over $10 a ton, which is at the time, 10 years ago, it didn't seem possible. So I think you're seeing the kind of market absorption of this, and it's becoming part of the way companies just factor that cost into doing business. And I think it's really interesting. But I think, going back to the main point I said, is that what it took, though, is to not come into with the preconception that we have to have it go this way. You have to be open to negotiation and listening to other people's points of view, and try to then also figure out how do you negotiate a path forward that actually helps the climate, but is also kind of accepted by the most people. So I think that was my main lesson learned from that initiative.
Thank you. And a question about, having spent so many decades working in the climate action space and having seen so much happening over this period of time. So how have you personally tried to keep the work-life balance, and like how do you unwind from the work?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I have two boys. My wife and I have two boys, and they're now, one of them actually is 22, just graduated from university, and is looking for a surprise, a green job. So he's looking in deforestation and doing things like GIS. So it's very exciting. But one of my main rules over my entire career, being super busy, was I was going to get home and eat dinner with the family. So even if it was, I was super busy, I would leave work at 6 or so, get home by 7, have dinner, and then maybe I would log back on, but I would make it a point that we had dinner together as a family. So that was a key thing. I also just, it's really, I really enjoy working in teams and leading people. And I think it's making that personal connection with everybody you work with, and not always just being about, okay, we had a good conversation about that deliverable, let's convene the meeting, but it's actually trying to, reach out and have personal conversations with colleagues and get to know them, and keep and the climate space is a very dynamic one, but there's a lot of people that I've kept friends, decades long friendships with people that are working in different organizations. And that's, you're part of a community, and that's really reinforcing. The final thing I'll say that is really, I do exercise a decent amount, and I like to keep active. And I just challenged myself last year with my first open water swim, where I swam 5 kilometers in Vermont and the lake. I used to swim in high school many years ago, and I hadn't swum in a while. And it was really fun to set a personal challenge like that and kind of get out of my, day-to-day climate space and just kind of focus on, okay, this is actually really hard to do. How do I train for it? And it was very, very satisfying when I finished it. And so I'm getting ready for my next race next summer.
That's awesome. I hope you enjoy it more and more as you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think coming to the last question that I have is around, some of us who are trying to unpack the climate action ecosystem for a lot of professionals and trying to see how do we transition a lot of people into thinking about climate and creating this environment for a lot of people to call what job they do as a climate job. So what do you think are the institutions and networks that will add value to us? And if we have to work with multilateral agencies like World Bank, what are the areas that we should focus on working with? And is there something that we can work with larger agencies that are enablers of the space?
Yeah, I mean, I think the World Bank Group is really excited to work with young people that are trying to get into this space and learn. So I think we have this, these MOOCs, these massive open online courses. We have a whole set of free climate training courses that people can log into. I was mentioning carbon markets. It's like carbon pricing 101. How do you learn who's doing what? How do you put something in place, or climate smart agriculture, or financing renewable energy. If you're really interested in this, there's a lot of free resources and data. There's the open knowledge portal that you should tap into. Encourage you to use that. We've also been producing a series of country climate change and development reports that look at like a diagnostic at the country level. So, we just published one for Nepal that I was heavily involved with a couple of weeks ago. So I would also encourage you to check out the website for these reports if you're in a particular country, because it gives you a nice roadmap of what the risks are, what the opportunities are, and what needs to be done. We also have something called Connect for Climate at the World Bank Group. That's kind of a youth-oriented climate action platform that I would follow it and be involved in that conversation, because they share a lot of the work we're doing, both at the global level, advocating for action, but then also very specific practical solutions at the country level. I think otherwise, it's like I said before, it's really exploded in terms of networks on climate. And, I just on LinkedIn, I have a climate change professionals groups and things that I follow people. I keep up with some of that. I think trying to get to the COP if you can is a great, even though it's very contentious and heavy negotiations, it's the world's best sort of expo, if you will, of climate professionals. And there's a lot going on there that you can learn and just kind of wander around and attend sessions and learn from some of the cutting edge research and solutions that are going on out there. But I think too, now that every sort of sector, like I mentioned before, whether it's health or education or agriculture, they all have kind of a green, climate professionals group, I'm sure now. And so I would encourage you, if you're kind of interested in climate, but you're not quite sure where you want, if you have I'm kind of interested in farming and food, and maybe just start to follow and get involved with some of the climate smart agriculture work that's out there, because, the more, for me at least, the more you can kind of break it down to specific topics, there's just a rich conversation going on that you can really sink your teeth into. And I'm sure as you're part of that, then, job conversations come up, and, people are hiring all over the place now for, a lot of companies and organizations are trying to bring in expertise on climate across the board. So I think it's a very, very promising sort of, area for entering into the new job world for new professionals.
Thank you, Tom. I promise this is the last question. I think any recommendations that you have in terms of books and podcasts that you might be following or hearing on climate and sustainability?
Yes. Okay. So, well, I loved, if it's more of a fiction book, Overstory is an amazing book about trees and preserving trees. And it's, I think it won the Pulitzer Prize. It'll change your view of how, how people are, kind of getting engaged with that. If you're looking for fiction, I think there's another book called The Moth Snowstorm, which I found very poetic and also very sad, because it documents how moths and other insects, and then by repercussion birds, have dramatically declined in our lifetimes around the world. It used to be that when you were, when I grew up in a rural area, you drive in the summer with your headlights on, and there would be just all these bugs flying around because they were attracted to the lights. Now they're really so someone called that, like, very poetically, a moth snowstorm. Now you drive and there's like 10% of the, it's like a 90% reduction in the bugs that you see. And that has a, as you can expect, it has an implication on the birds that eat them and throughout the ecosystem. So it was a very poetic and powerful book that I read. In terms of podcasts, I'm forgetting the name of it now. I feel bad. There's a woman named Leah Stokes. You may know well. She's an advocate at, I think in California here, a professor. She's a professor, and she does fantastic. I want to say it's called Climate Forward. And they look at, some of these issues. They unpack, it's kind of more US focused in some ways, where they look at legislation and things going on at the national level. But I think that they had did something on gender and climate, or something on the food sector and agriculture, what it needs to do. So I found that as a really good podcast as well. So those are some ideas, but I encourage you to. I know the World Bank has its own podcast, so of course check that out. But I think there are plenty of other platforms out there. I'm sure you'll enjoy.
Thank you so much for participating with us, and look forward to engage whenever we can. And we wish that you do the best that you can being in that position.
No, thank you. I really appreciate your invite to do this. It's been really fun to talk, and I hope some of this has landed with people. And I encourage you to you really should go into the climate field, because we need as many smart minds and energy as we can to really tackle this problem. It's really important. So thank you for hosting this conversation.
Thank you so much.